Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Bruce Sellery, and I am the president of the Canadian Club of Toronto. As Canada begins to reopen, the country is facing major economic challenges. Rebuilding our economy in partnership with Indigenous people will be key to ensuring equitable progress. And that is focus for our conversation today. This event is sort of an early celebration of National Indigenous Peoples Day, which will be held on Sunday, June the 21st. And we gathered together an extraordinary panel of experts to discuss rebuilding the economy, Indigenous project ownership, what meaningful partnership actually looks like, and how we will move forward together. Now, we are connecting virtually, but we still think it's really important to recognize the land on which the club sits and where many of us live and work. We are gathered on the territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat. These lands are historically governed by the Treaty of the Dish with One Spoon, a treaty between these Indigenous nations that solidified their commitment to share the territory and to protect the land and water. Let's take a moment to think about how we can honor the treaty's spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Now, a couple of logistical notes for you. If this is the first Canadian Club event you have attended, there are 3 buttons I want to point out. First is one that says click here to switch stream. If you happen to have a slower internet connection, if you press that button, it will take down the quality of your video, but you'll still have good quality audio. So that's a way to manage that. Second, there is the questions tab, and we would really love to hear from you. Any questions you have will go direct to our moderator. So just press that questions tab, and it'll be very clear how to send them through. The third is the request help button, which is the way you can get technical support if you're having trouble getting things to play appropriately. A special thanks to our event sponsor, that is RBC. We are very grateful for your support with today's discussion. Now, time to introduce our panelists. First off, Kim Baird. Kim is the owner of Kim Baird Strategic Consulting and the former chief of the Tsawwassen First Nation. John Burrows is a professor and the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Law at the University of Victoria. Bonnie Leask is the relationship lead at Watershed Partners, and Sean Willy is the president and chief executive officer for Desnethi Group. Today's moderator is Karen Restoule, the founder of Bold Realities and a director of the Canadian Club of Toronto. Now, one of the club's traditions that we have held for over a century now is that we do a toast. We do a toast to our country. And of course, usually that's done in person with the raising of a glass, but we're going to do that to the screen today. So if you've got something handy with a liquid of some sort in it, I'd ask you to raise your glass in a toast to Canada. Karen, I will now turn the Canadian Club podium over to you. All yours. You just need to unmute yourself.
There we go.
I know this is the first Zoom meeting you have participated in the last 13 weeks, so the Zoom buttons or the mute button's new, right?
Absolutely. It was all thumbs there. Thanks, Bruce. So Miigwech and Nyawan Bruce, welcome everyone. Today we are gathered to discuss how rebuilding Canada's economy in partnership with Indigenous peoples will be key to ensuring growth. In the last 30 years or so, we have seen a remarkable increase in Indigenous participation in the Canadian economy. While there have been significant tensions on projects, much like we recently witnessed in Wet'suwet'en territory with the Coastal GasLink pipeline, there have also been many successes. More than 1/3 of Indigenous communities across the country are engaging in resource development projects on their territories. And beyond resource development, Indigenous entrepreneurs are running businesses of all sizes in a range of sectors, retail, manufacturing, labor, giving private and public sectors the opportunity to support Indigenous entrepreneurs. In fact, Canadian Council on Aboriginal Business reports recently that there are currently more than 43,000 Indigenous businesses in Canada. And while many see this as a rise in the participation of Indigenous peoples in the Canadian economy, it could also be described as a revitalization of business and trade practices that extend far beyond the last 500 years. That entrepreneurial spirit is what we're here to discuss today. It has long existed amongst Indigenous peoples, and Sean Willy is here from Desnete. And Sean, can you tell us what the mission and vision of Desnete is?
Well, happy to be here, Karen. And first, I just want to give thanks to our elders who have come before us and our leaders that have set the table for us to have these conversations and for us to build off of their teachings. Desnete, our vision is to build off of that entrepreneurial spirit from the community of English River First Nation. English River First Nation has been in economic development, trying to create their own source of revenue for 30 plus years, looking at the strengths from what they can harvest from their lands in northern Saskatchewan. And, we feel we are now Indigenous capitalists. And really what that means is that we are more sustainable towards business going forward.
Thanks, Sean. You use that magic word, capitalist. Now, we know in our communities and Indigenous communities that sometimes comes with with a bit of a negative connotation. How are you balancing that pursuit as an Indigenous man?
Well, I think media has painted, the capitalist, what we see is unfettered capitalism within Wall Street and Bay Street. We see unfettered capitalism with, we see these tech giants grow, billionaires become even more billionaires. I think Indigenous capitalism and what I've learned from elders from Nunavut to Dene Country, Northwest Territories, Northern Alberta, Northern Saskatchewan, is that yes, you want to generate profit. You have to generate profit to provide own source and opportunity to the community. But as you mentioned, Indigenous capitalism has been around for hundreds of thousands of years. There's been trading, there's been farming, there's been fishing, there's been hunting, but there has been this additional focus on sustainability. And I look at sustainability really three different ways. We look at business in the long-term value. We look at it from a long-term Indigenous thought perspective. So there's a misalignment when I'm going out and talking to sort of the private equity group. There's a misalignment where we want to try to achieve with our First Nation Economic Development Corp because we're thinking long-term. We also look to make sure that the environment is included within everything we do. From a resource perspective, so we have large resources within English River's traditional territory. How are we involved in the design, the engineering of projects that come on traditional territory? How are we involved within the ongoing monitoring? And how are we involved in the reclamation decommissioning? If that environmental aspect is taken care of, then we can start to think about creating opportunities. And it's not just about making profit. So one of the things that differentiates us from your strictly capitalist is that we're not just out for return on investment. We're out for return on investment, but we're also out for creating employment for Indigenous people within our home community and across Canada. Because we think employment is the big game changer for Indigenous people everywhere we operate. So those three things, I think, add a bit more sustainability to what we're trying to do. In addition, I think, we create societal value. And I think that's why it's so important that we're having these discussions. We focus on community growth. The dividends that entities like Desnete create go back to support the community infrastructure. They go back to support community programming and elders and education. We do not provide per diem payments to people. We provide that hand up that I think is in benefit to the whole country, because history has shown that when you invest in socioeconomics of the most challenging communities, you raise everybody up.
Okay, great. And I believe Desnete, you're working on a project in partnership with another Indigenous community. Now, that type of nation building partnership is not really something that's talked about. I do know that that partnerships do exist, as they did prior to contact. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we're quite bullish on nation-to-nation dialogue and working with other First Nations, Métis, or Inuit communities at raising all of us up together. So this NETHE's been around for 30 years. We want to take that knowledge and share it with others, right? We understand that we were all once working together, trading, harvesting the land. Now we have to work together at sort of pushing back on some of the negatives that came out of the Indian Act. You know, they took away those entrepreneurial skills in some sense. So we want to go work with other nations to help build up, because we think economic development is contagious. It's addictive. Once people start creating own source revenue, you know, English River, you know, talking to the elders, they realize you can't move your culture up with government funding or philanthropic funding. So you need to create your own source of revenue. We want to share those practices, and we want to share our mistakes with other nations. And we feel that, you know, there's this mantra out there that our communities lack the capacity. And so we rush to sign agreements with non-Indigenous entities and businesses. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I think every First Nation goes on their own path to self-determination. But we feel there's other models out there that are more sustainable. That, you know, we have a workforce that is strong, female and male in Indigenous employment. So when other communities see that, that acts as a real strong motivator and role model. We also talk a bit more honestly about what we're both trying to achieve, and we create exit strategies. So when the community has the capacity, that we can leave. And I've seen too many examples of non-Indigenous businesses sticking around far too long, just for the sake of additional profit and revenue, and not really building up the community. So we're very bullish on working with other communities, you know, starting with a foundation of trust and relationship, culture, getting elders, females, women, youth, and sharing culture and laughing and putting out shared objectives for what we both want to achieve.
And you talk about how good, sound, culturally based processes will lead to better outcomes. Just to get a bit fluffy, what's your vision? What's your long-term vision? What do you see as we pursue nation-to-nation partnerships, and what kind of future does that unlock for our communities?
Well, I think Canada needs to focus, you know, all of us need to focus on building Canada up. And I want to see more independence, and I want to see more pride in Canada. I was born in Nunavik. I'm now living in just south of Saskatoon. It's the furthest south I've ever lived. And I look at, you know, what is it? 90% of Canadians live 150 kilometers from the border of the United States. I think we have this great value-added component of Indigenous populations, communities that have a willingness to build this country and our infrastructure and our resources, which could support Canada being more independent from what's happening, you know, below us. And I see that Indigenous people want to do this. I've seen such great examples of champions, such as our previous generations, and people who want to get to work and invest in themselves in training and education. You know, we have the fastest growing educated population coming to schools right now. We're not being aggressive enough at tapping into them. So I think Indigenous business can do that much easier. I just wish the country would look north to say, how can we harness the power of Indigenous peoples? And I've worked in corporate Canada for a good 20 years. And I've seen too often that corporate Canada puts Indigenous communities on a risk registry. And they should not be on the risk registry. They should be on the strengths of that company to create those relationships. And we've said this, and I think this is changing the way we look at our Indigenous communities, our Indigenous people, and our Indigenous business as a value-added strategy within a global marketplace that will only help us develop the resources, put the infrastructure where it needs to be, and educate and move the entire country up.
Yeah, that's a very good point to make, and it actually brings in Bonnie. Bonnie, I've always seen you as a relationship expert, and as Sean talks about, doing business with corporate Canada, I know that you're currently in that role with Watershed Partners, that you have previous experience with the National Chief's Office, as well as with Minister Bennett. you've certainly had your time in policy, and now you're helping to navigate relationships between public and private sector and communities. Can you tell us about that and any insights or advice that you have to give on how to ensure that those partnerships are respectful and profitable for everyone?
Good morning, Karen. Thank you. Thank you for this. I'm coming in from Treaty 6 and the homeland of the Métis, which for the rest of Canada, and I hope you learn, is Saskatoon. I'm excited to be here. A little kind of shocked that you asked me. This isn't normally a place I play, but it's interesting to be here. And full disclosure, I used to work for Sean, and I've met Kim through my relations through the National Chief's Office under former National Chief Sean Atlew. And I've only, like many people in Canada, only ever read about John Burroughs. So it's such an honor to be here. I can only speak from my own experience, Karen, and we've had a number of conversations about relationships and how they are, and the spaces that I've been in have primarily been in the Indigenous political space. And if I might be so bold to say that I've witnessed both systems from the inside, and I came out thinking, we're FUBAR'd. We need to do something. We need to just take a step back and not be FUBAR'd. And I think a large part of that is through the relationships. And I reflected on what Sean said about how English River approaches their land and their territory. And it is about the relationship. And if it's a relationship in the cycle of business in this case, so whether it's the design, engineering, it's that relationship that will carry you through. And like any relationship, whether it's personal, professional, or business, it's going to get complicated and it's going to get messy. And we have to be prepared for that. And we can't just walk away when it does. And we have to either draw on how we can meet those challenges together. And some of that is laid out in the RCAP. Some of it's laid out in the the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Calls to Action. So there are paths, but they're not the only paths. And I would strongly encourage non-Indigenous Canadians and business leaders to reflect on what their path for building a relationship is, because we all have them, like right from birth to the end of our lives. So what does that look like, and how do we come together when there's some challenges, but there's always opportunities?
So we talk about how these reports have highlighted, like you say, some recommendations, some calls to action, so that Canadians are have the tools that they need, or some sense of direction to allow them to participate as active partners in reconciliation. In terms of relationships and partnerships, what does that tangibly look like?
It looks like talking. Let's start talking. And it doesn't have to come in and be a talk of sitting across the table from one another. It has to be a discussion. Hi, how are you? And actually mean, hi, how are you? And having that conversation. And then once you get into that, you're able to discover so many connections. And sometimes you're compelled to be in those situations. And you don't want to be. For instance, I think what's taking place in the south of our border right now has a real impact here, because we do see the inequities that we always knew that they existed. COVID really just opened them up, and we'll see them again. So it's going beyond posting. It's going beyond statements. It's actually talking now. And making a commitment to talk and listen and learn from each other's words. Neither of us, if we're doing us and them, I don't really understand a lot of stuff in the business world, but that's okay. I'm willing to learn. So I think that's what's really important. So you need to have those voices. And, you know, Sean pointed out earlier, you did as well, like we're the fastest growing demographic. Some of the most incredible people are young, educated Indigenous youth. And I'm like, my mind is blown by their energy. And the fact that they're angry, and it's okay to be angry. Sure, y'all get mad at your kids or your wife or your husband or something. It's okay to be angry. It's how you use that. And a lot of these Indigenous youth are just blowing my mind with how they're encapsulating things and approaching them. And it's through talking.
So question for you. One of our colleagues, Max Finday at Canadian Roots Exchange, often says that today's youth will carry the mandate of implementing reconciliation. Would you agree or disagree with them?
I'm going to go with both because it's easier to say that. No, I'm just kidding. I'm going to go with both because there are going to be Indigenous youth that push. And then Max also made a comment in November that has stuck with me about how the next generation, they shouldn't be responsible for closing the gap. That's enough now. Like, my nieces and nephews and cousins, I have a lot. I want them to pursue what they want. And if it's advocacy, then they should. But if they want to be a designer or they want to be an architect or they want to be a musician, then they should do that. And they shouldn't have to worry about this gap being closed and all these structural inequities in the system. So I think it is a little bit of both. And I think Max is an example of that.
Okay, great. Speaking of investing in youth through education and empowerment, we're going to turn things over to John Burrows here, who is a professor at UVic Law. John, you also teach in an MBA program as well. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the work that you do through that program?
Sure. So at the law school, we teach Indigenous law, not just Canadian law as it relates to Indigenous peoples, which is to make the point that as Indigenous peoples, we have systems that discipline ourselves and allow for standards and principles, criteria, authority in arriving at decisions through principles and processes. And so it's important to recognize that law is not just something that parliaments do, but it's also something that communities create and have created for a long time. And so to focus on Indigenous law as well as Canadian law as it relates to Indigenous peoples is really important. In the MBA context, I teach at SFU in their Indigenous Executive EMBA, dealing with Indigenous business and leadership. And there it's about diversifying our portfolio. People come from all walks of life and they skill up accounting and marketing and strategic planning. And the idea there is to recognize that we shouldn't put all our eggs in one basket. Like most investors, we want to make sure that we are involving ourselves in different sectors and different ways so that if one area goes sour, we can turn to another area and allow that to be able to develop. So education is a way of allowing people to get the tools to be more flexible and to be more responsive, nimble, work on the fly, but to do that in a way that also draws upon Indigenous people's own practices of accounting. What is wealth or marketing? How do we share our ideas? Or if we're thinking about law, what is an Anishinaabe constitution, for instance? And these are the sorts of things that we have information about, and they're contemporary and they speak to the future, but they also have some roots in the past as well.
So when we talk about enabling or law at the community level, I think, for the average Canadian, the recent story with the Wet'suwet'en people and what transpired there with respect to the role of the hereditary leadership was a bit of an eye-opener in terms of the exercise of that governance system within that community, within that territory. So this is something that I think, for sure on my end, I've gotten a lot of calls and questions from colleagues from all over, asking questions about how this all works, and exploring the balance of power between, let's say, an Indian Act elected chief and council versus the hereditary leadership. So how, if we were to unpack that, John, and start, in the next 2 minutes, letting our friends here in on the source of a source of that power and jurisdiction, how would you do that in 2 minutes?
Yeah, so I think we need to have the freedom as Indigenous peoples to be different from other Canadians. And so we have laws that are working to facilitate that, Aboriginal title and treaties, and their information that's coming from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Missing and Murdered Women Inquiry, or RCAP. So we need that sort of freedom, but we also need the freedom to be different from one another as Indigenous peoples. And what happened with the Indian Act is it poured us into a mold that expected a certain type of governance, a certain type of compliance, and it was a very narrow basis of authority that we were able to exercise under that act that was always subject to the supervision of the Crown. And so what we're trying to do is get out of that narrow base and also that supervision by the Crown so that we can make our own decisions. But then making our own decisions requires an understanding that we have differences of opinions between ourselves within Indigenous communities. And we need to have laws which allow us to disagree with one another in an agreeable way. That's what law does. And so, for instance, the Anishinaabe people, what we've done in many places is constitutionalized our 7 grandmother and grandfather teachings, things like love and wisdom, humility, respect, truth, etc. And if we put that into a constitutional framework, then we have all these stories that teach us about how we work with love or how we work with humility. And you might think those are too big of a concept to be able to apply into law until you remember that our Canadian Constitution asks us to live with life, liberty, security, peace, order, good government. These are also broad aspirations. And so we need these economies of affection to be able to take place within our communities and through our own laws, revitalize or reinvigorate the ways that we disagree with one another in an agreeable way so that we can make points of decision and account for those that have differences of opinion and ensure that there's a certainty and that there's an order that takes place in the way that we proceed with our affairs.
Okay, so would you say that Indian Act governance framework is holding us back from opportunity?
I think it's a constraint. And it is the case that the Indian Act's governance does allow people to talk with one another over narrow things, but it doesn't allow us to talk in the way we would like to talk. And so, yeah, it is holding us back. I have a lot of respect for those that are running our communities as chiefs and councils, and I think there's a lot that can be done within that envelope, but it really is playing in the smaller box. Our larger box is our entire traditional territories and the responsibilities that we have for those territories. And then the relationships that we create between territories, Anishinaabe with Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe with Cree, Anishinaabe with the Ontario government, Anishinaabe with the federal government. And we need to be ensuring that we're diversifying our portfolio again, that we're not just putting all our eggs in that one basket of an Indian Act system, but seeing that there is so much more that we can be involved in, and that we do have business principles and legal principles that speak directly to questions of investment and reinvigoration and getting us back to work after what we're experiencing here.
So we often hear people say the treaties set out the relationship. And when we talk about, when you talk about how we live with one another, how we relate with one another as nations, as governments, what is the role of treaty in your view vis-a-vis opening up economic opportunity?
Yeah, so any relationship requires rules, or it requires understandings about how you're going to get along in that relationship in case you have a dispute or a difference of opinion. And treaties provide those guidelines. They're constitutional, after all. They're recognized in Section 35(1) of our Constitution Act 1982. Here in British Columbia, there's the United Nations a Declaration Act that's implementing treaties. And so, for instance, we started thinking about the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. That is a treaty about economic relations. White is the dominant motif on that agreement, which means that we will relate to one another with peace and friendship and respect. But in the middle of that treaty is a bowl. And that bowl has one spoon, which means that you don't bring a threatening object like a knife or a fork to that relationship. And it also recognizes that you're sharing from the same territory, and that sustainability point that Sean was making earlier. And this treaty came to pass after 50 years of war between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee from 1650 to 1701. So what it means is you work with your enemy and you make them your friend, and you find ways through the treaty relationship to ensure that you can economically share in a way that's not threatening to one another. And that's just one treaty. There's so many treaties that we have that speak to these aspects of mutual revitalization. My great-great-grandpa signed a treaty dealing with 1.5 million acres of land in Ontario. And I know in that treaty that there's information that is about how you share in a way that is mutually productive. And that's a part of law. That's a part of the law of Canada, as well as Anishinaabe law. And so it's bringing those two legal systems together so that we have principles and processes in a kind of a law and order type way that are Indigenous law and order, as well as what Canadian law has to say on this.
That's great. Thank you, John. This is actually a good moment to bring in Kim to the conversation with from Tsawwassen. Kim Baird was the chief who, with the power of her community, was able to work on, develop, and see through a treaty that would set out the relationship in that territory. Kim, do you want to tell us a little bit about your story?
Yeah, good morning from the West Coast here. Happy to have been invited for this discussion, and thanks to my panelists, and again, thanks for the invitation. I think you can think of Tsawwassen as kind of like a case study in these broader concepts that have been discussed this morning for what we've tried to do to make change on the ground. When I was elected chief, I spent 13 years trying to lead change for my community and working under the Indian Act system and working in poverty, even though we're in the Lower Mainland, 35 kilometers away from Vancouver. And so my community instructed me to set out to close the socioeconomic gap. And to do that, we looked at the tools that were available to us. And that was negotiating a modern land claim agreement with self-governance. The model is controversial. Not everyone agrees that that's the way forward. But for us, I had strong mandate from my community to pursue that. So 11 years ago was the effective day of our treaty, which took 14 years to negotiate, and set out some cash, some land. But I think the most important thing it gave us was jurisdiction over our lands. And so that was the toolbox for us to create our own governance structure. We had to do our own internal reconciliation as a community to figure out our way forward. How were we going to organize ourselves? Were we going to integrate hereditary traditional systems or not? And if not, why not? We had a lot of issues to organize ourselves around and to figure out a way to uphold our values as Coast Salish people. And so it was very much community-led process, and the results have been remarkable. Our first flagship development was Tsawwassen Mills, and with Ivanhoe Cambridge, and that was about a $780 million project. And it was that kind of project we needed to coordinate our infrastructure planning around for long term and allowed us to play in the bigger box that John was referring to. And so over the past 11 years, we've invested about 140 million in infrastructure alone. And that's not the programs and services that are enhanced, the investments in our culture. So for us, the jurisdiction was critical for us to be able to have autonomy. It's not sovereignty, but we don't have the Crown micromanaging our affairs anymore. And, you know, it reminds me of a joke that the lawyer from the Niska used to tell. He said that First Nations view treaties as solemn marriages and governments viewed them as divorces. So we kind of prepared for the divorce in Tsawwassen, wanting to have autonomy and being able to do things other communities take for granted, whether it be municipalities and cities or what have you, which is to have control over land use planning, have control over municipal style services, and just really basic things that Canadians take for granted. And I don't think people really can appreciate the gap there is on every level, from socioeconomic conditions to the infrastructure gap, clean water and energy, and all those things that First Nations are light years behind rest of Canada. So for us, we chose our path to reconciliation with a modern land claim agreement and self-governance. And 11 years out, things seem to be working well, although there are tons of challenges with it, there's no doubt.
On the challenge front, can you tell us, I know that you and I have talked about this before, I know that you've faced significant pushback, not within your own community, although I know as a chief you manage that those relationships and that process quite well. But you face challenges with the governments that were in and around your territory. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I faced opposition from our member of parliament, from our mayor and council, and it was the first treaty through the BC treaty process. The Niska had the first modern treaty in British Columbia, but that was outside of the BC treaty process. And so there's a lot of turf wars going on with different jurisdictions protecting their own turf and not wanting to let Tsawwassen in. And it was extremely challenging and with a lot of public scrutiny. A lot of it was in the media. But, you know, our strategy was to tell Canadians and British Columbians and Deltans from our neighboring municipality what we're trying to overcome and what we're trying to achieve. And at the end of the day, when we did reach a treaty, there was no groundswell of public opposition locally because we're really transparent about our need to become, to restore our place within the Lower Mainland. And most people agreed with that. So it was super challenging. Even a lot of my peer First Nation leaders had issues with our agreement. And I think there's a lot of questions about whether the model makes First Nations have to give up too much, try to fit into a system that's not really ours, and lots of things like that. And we're finding our way through, and our community has been very open to sharing our experience with any other First Nation across the country or across the world, in fact, in trying to help others figure out their path forward. We believe in self-determination, which means it's up to us to figure out our path forward. It's up to other communities to figure out their path forward. It's not really any of our business to tell them what they shouldn't or shouldn't be doing, but only help them the best way we can. And so, and we have lots of people asking for our help, and I'm glad my community, I mean, I haven't been chief for about 7 years now. I was no good deed goes unpunished. I wasn't reelected after everything I had worked towards for my community, which was a very humbling experience, but it's allowed me to move on and develop a consulting business to advise industry, government, and First Nations about all kinds of issues. So it's interesting times to be involved in Indigenous issues. And I think there's tons of opportunities for everybody going forward if we have the right mindset for it.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for that, Kim. I just always find your personal story and the story of your community very insightful, and to be, like you say, not a framework for success, but to be drawn upon to help other communities proceed as they choose their own path. So I note the time, it's 12:42, so we have about 10 or so minutes for some questions, and they are pouring in here. Some of them are very hot. I don't know how the panel wants to jump on this one. I see Bonnie's ready to take it on. So one question is the different interpretation of UNDRIP. Some see it as a tool to be used for a better future for Indigenous peoples, and some see it as a veto, a power over resource development in Canada. Which way are we going? Bonnie, do you want to take this one?
What? I think that the framework of UNDRIP sets up the relationship. And you have the option of being able to determine what that looks like. And I reflect on all the comments, and I want to make sure that I'm clear that there's space everywhere, particularly in this time, and it highlights that that there's just not Indigenous spaces. We're part of all spaces in Canada. And so I don't think we should have that narrow focus. I think we need to open up that focus. And when I think of UNDRIP, it's about the relationship, and it's about how that's set up. And when I think about it in a government context, because quite frankly, that's the place that I've been the most, how do you look at those values and concepts? Have the discussion about the veto. Like, who has the veto anyways? So let's have that discussion. And what does that veto mean? Like, is it full stop? Is it like, let's get through the process? Let's set some checks and balances. I think in any kind of process, you always have check-ins, and that's UNDRIP gives that ability to kind of have that big space to do those check-ins and make sure that that are some basic things that were referred to earlier by Kim that we suffer the inequities from. So whether it's, those social ones or those business ones. So I think that there's space in UNDRIP for that, and have the conversation. I feel like we start the conversation and then we stop when we get mad. Well, we probably don't do that at home. Maybe some of us do, but but you certainly don't do it in business. Okay, I'm mad at you. Bye. Like, no. So continue the conversation. When it gets hot, acknowledge that, and I think drawing from Kim's comments and Professor Burrows, like, don't be scared of those concepts and values and those challenges, because you have something to balance it on the other end. You just need to welcome it, that maybe before there wasn't a sense of vulnerability that you could display. Well, guess what? We're now in COVID. Everyone's vulnerable. So use it.
That's right. Just for clarification, I realize we used a term that may not be familiar to everyone in the audience. UNDRIP refers to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So colloquially, we use UNDRIP, obviously the abbreviation for obvious reasons. And the veto that we're referring to refers to the section of that declaration that touches on the free, prior, and informed consent. And so just for clarification there, I realized we might be leaving some folks out of the conversation on that one. Bonnie, when you were sharing your thoughts on the veto power on FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, it reminded me of another question that I often get, and that actually a similar question has been raised for discussion here, is particularly with respect to Wet'suwet'en territory and the conflict that was taking place there. We saw, a number of blockades pop up across the country. There was question as to whether those were fringe groups or if those were actual Indigenous nations who were standing in support of Wet'suwet'en. There was question around the one common question that was heard in frustration is who's in charge, right? So there was this frustration among Canadians. Who do we go talk to bring about resolution to this conflict? So who wants to take that one? John, I feel like this fits into a little into the Indigenous governance discussion. So do you want to take a poke at that?
Sure. First of all, to make the point that the word veto does not appear in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it is free, prior, and informed consent. Veto is a concept in Canadian law in limited circumstances. And so that conversation about veto or who's in charge is, as Bonnie says, something that has to be worked out from point to point to point. And so I just kind of think about this question of who's in charge when you're thinking about Indigenous communities, and you ask the same thing about Canada. Who's in charge? Is it the federal government? Is it in Quebec or Alberta or Ontario? Right? There are different ways that we structure our authority for different purposes. And so sometimes in an Indigenous community, the persons that are in charge are the clan mothers or the hereditary leaders. In another instance, it might be the band council leaders. In another instance, if you're dealing with an education matter, you should go talk with the principal of the school. That is understanding that authority is diffuse within Indigenous communities, and that's a good thing, just as authority is diffuse within Canada. We don't want to have everyone sort of pulling authority to themselves and creating a dictatorship. We want to make sure that authority is shared. And so when authority is shared, you'll have people with different responsibilities for questions at the end of the day. And then what you need is a clarity of process. And when you don't have a clarity of process, then that's when you get to blockades. That's when things break down and you're unable to resolve these issues. So I want to make the point that you learn about the groups that you're working with, just as you would learn with any corporation or government. And you can figure out who's in charge. And then you need the processes to ensure that that we do actually empower the proper decision makers.
Okay, great. Thank you. Before I turn to the next question, does anyone have anything to add to that?
I just want to build on John's comments and say that on the processes part, the processes that currently exist in my feeling are the ones that are FUBARD. And that there's different processes that we can take that that aren't hidden in code language about lifelong relationships that shouldn't translate to lifelong dependence. And so how we get there is by collaborating together. And again, going back to that comment that John made about listening. And I'm sure that Kim and I know Sean can talk about the value and importance of listening. And then there's almost that aha moment. Look for that. And it'll probably be outside a process.
Very good point. Very good point. Okay, last question for today. And what we'll do, I'm going to start out with Sean, and I'm going to look to each of you either in response to the question or for final thoughts. The question, Sean, is what actions would you like to see from the federal government to help strengthen Indigenous economic empowerment?
I think they need to lead by example. You look at other jurisdictions and they have programs that specifically target procurement. I think we've made big strides with this government indicating they want to move to a 5% spend with Indigenous communities. it is around the socioeconomic conditions, and I agree with John and Bonnie on their assessment of UNDRIP and creating that relationship. And I think the government, not only government, corporate Canada needs to drive this more. They're more flexible, they have more options, but ownership in projects, deployments plans, procurement plans, community investment plans, engagement plans, and again, put it on your value added sheet, not on your risk registry. So again, the federal government, I think, just needs to be more flexible at working with Indigenous on the business side, because we have such a great history of legal minds, of academics. We need to create that same on the business side, push us forward to support the rights and the title we're gaining over time. That's always been there. Now we need to create the economics to provide opportunities for our young people.
So if what I'm hearing from you, Sean, is that good governance is at the root of a strong economy, or is it the other way around?
No, I think good governance. You need good governance. You need strong. English River has not had one chief who's made economic development possible. It's been 10 different chiefs over time, and that's strong community governance, right? We're not just dependent on one person. So I think there's an example right there.
And you say the role of the Crown vis-a-vis private sector. That's something that's often discussed is the policy framework holding us back? Is private sector leading the way on reconciliation? I mean, I can think of some companies that have been doing business right, with many communities, nations across the country. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I grew up in the territories, worked in the mine, so I am a pro resource development person. And I look at, if the resource development wasn't out there and our communities didn't push and fight to get a spot at the table for socioeconomic opportunities through duty consult, through legal ramifications, through IBAs, I don't know where Indigenous business would be today. So I think the resource industry has driven it. It is a journey. So those relationships adapt and change over time as the community grows and as needs grow. But I think the governments have been slower to move because they're bigger entities, because there is a public policy discussion there. But it's really only been a certain sector of industry. There is still lots of work to be done with telecommunications, with communications companies, with banking industry. Everybody's dipping their toe in, but they're so scared to make a mistake. A lot of companies are so scared to make a mistake, they'll take 3 steps back. But there's such a wealth of knowledge out there within our communities that can guide communities and companies with a strong value proposition. And again, it's about creating a shared value proposition for both our Indigenous businesses, our Indigenous communities, and corporate Canada.
And I see Bonnie nodding. Bonnie, any final thoughts to share?
I think that I'm in a little different thought process here, because I think government is actually what caused the problem, and so they need to get out of the way. And I think we all need to stop relying on government to fix things. Again, they caused the problem, so why would we go back to the architect to get them to fix it? And that's where the personal relationships kind of come in. And as I stated and is noted in my bio, I've worked in both systems, and I just came away with, snafu, foobar, we got to do something different. And for me, it's that collaboration, it's that understanding, and it's understanding, it's also, knowing the policy, but it's understanding outside the policy. And, and Sean said, people are scared to make mistakes. Man, we all make mistakes. So let's own them, acknowledge them, honor them, and move on.
That's great. And Kim, any final thoughts to share today?
Well, I think on the question of what the federal government could do, I have lots of opinions about that. I do think that there needs to be a new sort of relationship when it comes to fiscal relations with the government and First Nations. And I think, there's a big gap between what politicians say and what the public service is kind of trained to do. And I think, the Department of Finance either needs to lead some new thinking in relation to fiscal relations or get out of the way, I guess. But there's all kinds of strategies that could be used, including procurement and infrastructure programs or what have you. But, it's been no mystery that First Nation access to capital has been a huge gap for decades upon decades. And so I just don't know how the government can wrap its head around a more sort of fiscal relation approach to these issues. I don't know that the current departments that have been trying to move the needle can do it without, some of the more central agencies being involved. So, those are some of my ideas about what can happen. I just want to say too that a lot of questions from industry about UNDRIP and consent and vetoes and all that, I think, and who has the authority to speak to. I think, instead of looking at issues on a transactional basis and you base them on a relationship basis, you're in a much stronger position to navigate some of these uncertain waters, and they're uncertain for everybody. I would also think that aside from, the comments earlier by Sean about the risk register approach, this is the moment of our time in this country to advance things towards reconciliation. And there are plenty of frameworks out there. I think civic society and industry have a huge role to play. We can't rely on just First Nations and government to sort this out. Education initiatives are needed, and I can't stress how important it is that everyone gets involved in trying to overcome these issues that face us all as Canada. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Agreed. And John, turning to you for the final word.
Yeah, I think about what happened after World War II, another time of emergency, and there was an investment made in education. There was something called the GI Bill in the United States, where they recognized that people needed new skills and they needed new approaches after having gone through so much trauma. And we're in an age of trauma. And so we need that sort of investment that would allow people through a GI Bill type of opportunity to retool, to secure the education, the opportunity they need, so that they can then be empowered to go out and spend that investment as they also identify.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. And thank you to all of you, Kim, Sean, Bonnie. What a wonderful way to spend a lunch hour. I'm definitely walking away inspired and empowered with some nice tools to move forward with as we build this country up post-COVID. And I really appreciate your time and insights today. So miigwech, nyawen. Bruce, I believe we're turning it over to you.
You are indeed. Thank you very much, Karen. And thank you so much to all of our panelists. I echo everything that Karen said. Insight, the wisdom, and the passion for Indigenous business is really an inspiring conversation for us to have been a part of at the Canadian Club. So thank you so much for that. Another thank you goes to our sponsors today, RBC, and as well as RBC, our AV supplier, Van Valkenburg Communications and livemeeting.ca. Two programming notes for you. On the 10th of June, we will be hosting the Minister of Finance for the province of Ontario. The Honourable Rod Phillips will be here to discuss, among other things, the next phase of reopening for Ontario. That's on June 10th. The next day, June 11th, we will be celebrating Gay Pride, celebrating LGBTQ Pride, and in particular, the power of drag. So we go from our finances in this province are a really big drag to the power and magic of drag. That's coming up from the Canadian Club. Thank you so much for finding some time in your day to join us today, and stay tuned for more events ahead from the Canadian Club of Toronto. Have a great day.